And then I have to say welcome, everyone. It's good to see you, and we're going to get started on lessons 9 and 10 together. But before we do that, there was something last week that I'd like for us to think about. And I want you to imagine what it means to be in an infancy stage, So I'm going to share screen here and pop this up. And I want us to work together on imagining the qualities of a nation that we might label as in its infancy stage. Now, the purpose of this is to think about children that we've raised, children that we've been around. I happen to be a grandfather now of a 3.5-year-old, and expecting to be a grandfather in April. And so when I see these stages from infancy to toddler, I'm trying to encourage you then to see them and then apply them to the nation of Israel. As we said last time we were together, that Israel has now crossed over into the promised land, and they separated out in their tribes, and each tribe took a geographical position. But we're in the period of the judges, and what are some qualities and characteristics of infant toddlers that we might label? And then is there a way to apply those to the nation of Israel in its infancy stage? So let's have a go at that. Just shout them out if you think you might know of 1 or 2 or 4. We'll make.
How about impatience?
I'm sorry?
How about impatience?
Good.
Immaturity. Maybe not. Oh, okay.
Well, immaturity is one that kind of marks all of them to some extent. We could now begin to label, under immaturity a whole list. In fact, we could move impatience down under immaturity. But let's keep it there. It's okay. I think like I said, I think we could easily, the immaturity of infancy stage could be a way of labeling this, but let's go.
Curiosity.
Not demanding.
Dependent.
Mm.
Dependent.
Testing the boundaries.
Mm.
You guys are doing good. I don't have anything in mind here, by the way. I mean, I've done this exercise a number of times, but I don't, whatever you sense.
Trying to assert independence.
How about fearless?
Well,
Say again, Sheila.
Fearless.
that's true.
Good one.
What am I looking for?
They don't have a sense of consequences. Action with consequences, yes.
Mm.
Lincoln was over the other day, and we were watching him, and he dumps toys out, but senses no responsibility to pick anything up. I guess I could say that irresponsible.
That's a good one.
Demanding.
Always, how about temper tantrums?
Right. Well, you've done well. I don't, again, we could sit here all night and play with this, but as you as you make your way now into, we have a little one in our worship here lately. She has an older sister, but when this little one comes up for the children's sermon, she's all over the place. And I think that in the one of the things I notice about kids is they fill up space. If there's a large room, they'll fill up the whole room. I don't know even how to label that, but I see that in Lincoln too. When my son and daughter-in-law bring Lincoln over to church, when they worship with us in the contemporary service, he thinks the whole gym belongs to him. And so he wanders all around, and as you know, it has to do with boundaries, has to do with dependence, independence. By the way, notice the in our list, notice that we put dependent, as Laura mentioned, but notice two down below, asserting independence. How does that fit in with Adam and Eve? How does that fit in? Remember last week we talked about the wheel of history going. How does that fit in from being faithful and then apostasy and then a correction is applied? Notice how this goes. And frankly, friends, that's the point of this. The point is, as Israel now moves into its promised land, we see a nation beginning to trying to assert itself, and yet finding themselves still in an infancy stage, that they are an immature country. They seem to be impatient, and that is exhibited all through their history. Demanding, yes. Dependent, yes. Testing boundaries. What a great thing. Fearless. Yeah. I think fearless, and yet remember the incident when Moses sends the 12 spies over into the land. The first time they approach the promised land, God wants them to take the land. Moses sends 12 spies. 2, Joshua and Caleb, come back and say, we can take the land. 10, however, come back and say, we can't. So, there's a degree to which we almost have to say a fearless, fearful. Why do children have a fear that there's something under their bed or something in the closet? They're fearless in terms of knowing what danger looks like when you get them out on the sliding board, but they're fearful at other moments. So, think about what I'm trying to get you to think about is the immaturity of this nation, and do they ever get over that immaturity? The immaturity of the United States of America, do we ever get over that immaturity? We could talk about that the rest of the evening in some respects, but I wanted to do this exercise to help us get our gears going and think about what nation of Israel now becomes. Temper tantrums. If you read the book of Exodus, and Moses is out in the desert, just think of the temper tantrums that you heard while that was going on. Why did you have to bring us out here to die? Couldn't we have died in Egypt? Why do we have to eat quail and manna every day of our lives? All of that noise that had to go on, and Moses had to tolerate. Okay, I'm going to stop that. And if you'll get your papers out for chapter 9, we now see the people moving away from the period of the judges and now moving into the period of the king. And we'll notice how this happens. Now, when I ran this afternoon, I don't know why. I can't understand why, but it had moments when it just hiccuped, and it would pause, and then it would move and pause. So this might take a little longer than we would like. I do like this presenter. I think she's a very good one, Kathleen Farmer, and so we'll put her on and let her teach us. But be tolerant, be patient. Be patient with this video. There we go. Everybody okay?
Good stories often involve fascinating and entertaining characters. Such characters tend to go through crises that are true-to-life experiences of common people. The biblical account about Samuel, Saul, David, their descendants, and Israel's search for leadership is one of those skillful stories. Some of this narrative deals with personal issues that are prevalent occurrences for many.
Come on now. We'll start over.
Good stories often involve fascinating and entertaining characters. Such characters tend to go through crises that are true-to-life experiences of common people. The biblical account about Samuel, Saul, David, their descendants,
Don't you
and
dare.
Israel's search for leadership.
Come on now.
This narrative deals with personal issues that are prevalent occurrences for many. Other parts of it may only relate to people who hold various sorts of leadership positions in the various political, militaristic, or corporate arenas. The historians who recorded the story of the divided monarchy were inclined to relay the good and the bad of the leaders within Israel. Listen, as Kathleen Farmer discusses the stories of these good and bad leaders and what they can still teach us about holding our leaders and ourselves accountable as God's people.
The end of the book of Judges describes an awful state of moral, ethical, and political anarchy in the time when the tribes of Israel were loosely gathered into tribal confederations, occasionally led by charismatic military leaders called judges. The historians who gathered together the material we now find in Judges concluded that such anarchy prevailed because in those days there was no king in Israel, and all the people did whatever they decided was right in their own eyes. The first book of Samuel describes a similar picture of religious and moral corruption, even among the religious leaders, the sons of Eli, the priests who had descended from Aaron, the brother of Moses. And in Samuel's time, the Israelites' claim to possess the land of Canaan also was seriously threatened by a massive invasion of the sea peoples, later called Philistines. Samuel was said to have been a judge who was able to keep the Philistine threat at bay by leading Israel back into a faithful relationship with the Lord. But as Samuel got older, the elders of the tribe of Israel decided that the Philistines posed a military threat too large to be handled by a volunteer army under a volunteer judge. So they asked Samuel to appoint them a king, to govern them like other nations were governed, and to lead them to military victory against their enemies. Samuel was reluctant to appoint the people a king because he saw their request as a rejection of the Lord's kingship over Israel. But eventually, a man named Saul from the tribe of Benjamin was chosen to be the first human king of Israel. Saul was a successful military leader, but the Lord was said to have rejected him for his lack of obedience to the Lord's commandments. In his place, Samuel anointed David, the youngest son of Jesse, from the tribe of Judah, to be the second king of Israel. Under David's leadership, all of the tribes of Israel were organized into one united kingdom, strong enough to repel any invaders. In order to minimize the already existing rivalries between the tribes, David and his troops captured the centrally located Jebusite city of Jerusalem and made it into the new capital of the United Kingdom. But this unification of the tribes into a single political unit lasted only a little more than 70 years. After David's death, his son Solomon made the United Kingdom into a notable power in the ancient Near East. He built the first temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. But Solomon's opulent lifestyle and his many building projects placed a heavy burden of taxes and forced labor on the people. When Solomon died and Solomon's son Rehoboam threatened to increase rather than lighten their burdens, the people of the 10 northern tribes rebelled and set up their own kingdom that they called Israel. Only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to the Davidic line of kings, who continued to rule over the southern portion of the kingdom, which was now known as Judah. The northern tribes chose a king of their own named Jeroboam and set up sanctuaries of their own in Bethel and Dan to rival the temple of the Lord that Solomon had built in Jerusalem. The northern kingdom of Israel, with its capital in Samaria, and the southern kingdom of Judah, with its capital in Jerusalem, coexisted, sometimes as enemies and sometimes as friends, for 200 years. This period of the divided monarchy is the time when most of the classical prophets were active. The prophets preached primarily to the kings of Israel and Judah, warning them that their failure to keep the terms of the covenant would inevitably lead to national disaster. The kings of Judah descended in an unbroken line of succession, giving Judah a great deal of political stability. But in the northern kingdom of Israel, different dynasties repeatedly rose and fell, contributing to Israel's instability as a nation. In 721 BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the massive military power of Assyria. Judah managed to survive the Assyrian threat by becoming a vassal state, paying tribute to Assyria and putting Assyrian idols in the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. When Assyria in its own turn fell to the power of Babylon, the kings of Judah tried to regain their independence. But in 586 BCE, the Babylonians laid siege to Jerusalem, destroyed the city, demolished the temple of the Lord, and forcibly move the religious and political leaders of Judah into exile in Babylon. And it was there, in Babylon, during the period of the exile, that the priests, the prophets, the theologians, and the historians of Judah began to put their history and their traditions into the written form in which we now find them in the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And while the people in Samuel's time may have had high hopes concerning what a king could do for them, the historians who wrote from the perspective of the exile looking back realized that their kings were sometimes faithful, but more often faithless leaders of a sometimes faithful, but more often faithless people. The historians, writing from the perspective of the exile, neither idealized their kings nor attempted to glamorize the stories of their personal and political lives. In the historians' eyes, each of the kings of Israel and Judah contributed in some way to their nation's downhill slide toward destruction. Even David, who comes about as close to being an ideal king as any of the kings did in the history of Israel and Judah, even he is pictured as a man with serious flaws in his character, who makes foolish, sinful choices that will have disastrous consequences for the health of the United Kingdom. Now, we tend to remember David only as a charming, flamboyant, charismatic leader who was able to unite the tribes and lead the nation to security and prosperity. We admire him for his deeds of heroism, for his musical ability, for the covenant that God was said to have made with him. But the historians carefully remind us that David also chose to commit adultery with Bathsheba, and that he arranged for Bathsheba's husband to be killed in an attempt to avoid the consequences of his immorality. They tell us that David refused to punish his eldest son Ammon when Ammon raped his half-sister Tamar, and that he allowed his sons Absalom and Adonijah to create political havoc in the kingdom. The historian, speaking in 1 Kings, comments critically on the fact that David never disciplined his sons nor called them to account for their actions. And Solomon, who was said to have been the wisest man alive in his time, is also said to have made some very unwise choices. The first thing the historians tell us about Solomon's reign is the story about how he murdered all of his potential rivals in order to establish his own power securely. And the last thing they tell us about Solomon has to do with his idolatry, how he worshiped the foreign gods of his many wives. Modern readers tend to think that the historians included the lavish descriptions of Solomon's glory, his wealth, his thousands of horses and chariots, as a positive part of his kingly image. But if we pay attention to what Moses says in Deuteronomy 17:14-20, we will see that the glory Solomon gathered around himself was strictly forbidden for an Israelite king. Moses tells the people that their kings must not acquire many horses at the people's expense, that they must not acquire many wives for themselves, that they must not acquire a great quantity of silver for themselves. The description of Solomon's glory in 1 Kings 10 makes it sound like the law of kingship in Deuteronomy 17 was formulated with Solomon's excesses directly in mind. And in 1 Samuel 8:10-18, Samuel's warning to the people about the negative consequences that would come from their insistence on having a king like other nations sounds like it also could have been directly based on Solomon's oppressive practices. In hindsight, the historians could see that a style of living and ruling like Solomon would lead the people to cry out, as Samuel said they would cry out, against the king that they had chosen for themselves. In most of the rest of the ancient Near East, kings were considered either superhuman or divine. In Egypt, the pharaoh was treated as an earthly manifestation of divinity, And in Babylon, kings were thought of as the special servants of the gods, who acted as intermediaries between the gods and humankind. But the historians of Judah considered their kings to be fully human, as prone to sin and as prone to make serious mistakes in judgment as we ourselves are, and as our national leaders today are. In the eyes of Israel's historians, the fact that David was the Lord's anointed did not mean that everything David did was admirable or wise or approved of by the Lord. The way in which the history of the kingship in Israel and Judah has been handed down to us presents us with a model for our own time. The historians, the priests, the prophets, and the theologians of Israel and Judah considered it an act of faith to criticize their kings. They considered it an act of faith to call their leaders to account for their errors in judgment. And so should we.
If there was a drummer there, he would go, bump. Could put a punctuation mark on that. So let's use our worksheet here to make sure we're in tune with what was said to us. He's a very good teacher, and I think we should have gained considerably, and he connects a lot of dots too as we had our readings. So what difficulties characterize the end of the book of Judges and into the book of First Samuel? What was life like there as we hear the historians tell it?
According to the lecturer there, or the speaker, there was anarchy, chaos, and Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes.
That's right on. And this, by the way, includes as she says just a few sentences later, includes the religious culture. One of the reasons that Samuel is able to rise to power has to do with the corruption and judgment of God on what is known as the sons of Levi. So notice that it's just not, the judges are not just chaos and people doing what was right in their own eyes, but also the religious leaders were not, keeping themselves honorable in practice of faith and calling for the practice of faith on the part of the people. So into that kind of a chaos, then Samuel marches and is committed. What did they blame their difficulties on?
They didn't have a king.
Didn't have a king. Isn't that sad?
They were felt threatened by the Philistines.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The Philistines had grown in power, and if you study this period of time, we see that this is the moment of the beginning of what is known as the Iron Age. And I think there's also bronze involved in this. In other words, the metallics of things were now becoming a science. And what happened was the people along the coast, the Philistines, for instance, they were able to catch this movement, and they became much more powerful in terms of their military abilities because of the advent of the Iron Age, and with that, of course, Israel was a lot slower to get on that train, and so they were deeply threatened, especially by the Philistines. Although that wasn't the only place the threats come from. I think this time it'd be a place to do a share screen of a map. And you can begin to see, and this is the divided kingdom, by the way. We're not quite there yet, but notice the Philistines are along the coast. And as you must know, the coasts and the attentiveness of those who are looking for advancement, the coast is a place where the ideas are shared much more readily. That is not to say that Israel didn't have coastline. You can see clearly that they did. But what do you do with that? What do you do with that coastline that allows you to take in ideas through your port cities? The Philistines were very astute, and the Israelites were not quite as astute.
Did
But-
they have ships?
I'm sure they did. Well, yes, they did. If they did not, at least ships were definitely plying the waters. We don't hear much of the military might of Israel at sea. That doesn't seem to be, in fact, that doesn't seem to be an issue at all in terms of what you would call military might. The more important thing about shipping was the economic might that it provided. And that's especially true when we get a little further along in the Roman Empire. One of the reasons is the sea is seen as a place of chaos. Remember, we're dealing with a primitive people, and there are creatures out in the sea that we're still afraid of. Ships were not big, and as a consequence, shipping isn't like we have now, nor is it reflected in military might. But it is still, if you were in the shipping business, you would stay close to the coastline. However, later on, we find a reference to shipping. Who's the character that gets himself on a ship? He didn't want to go to Nineveh. That's your hint.
Jonah?
Jonah. So Jonah gets on a ship, and clearly it's a trading ship, because when they begin to have trouble, before they throw Jonah overboard, what are they doing?
Throwing everything else. The
Yeah,
cargo.
all their cargo is going out. So any profit that they might have had is overboard, till finally Jonah confesses that he's probably the reason for their the danger that they find themselves in. So anyway, what I want to give you a sense for is the lay of the land. But notice over here we have the Edomites. You're going to hear about them. If you read the scriptures, you're going to hear about them. Here's the Moabites, the Ammonites. Over here are the Arameans. We don't hear much about them, but they are such a desert nation over here that they wouldn't have asserted much power. Walt, did you did you go to Jordan after Israel?
Yes.
So you visited the rock walled city of Petra.
Yes, we
And
did.
look down here at the bottom is the Nabattu tribes, and Petra was built by the Nabateans. So it too does not become so much of a threat to Israel unless it forms alliance with the Moabites or the Edomites, and then they would have a way to be a threat to Israel. Up here we have Damascus. That's going to be, and notice too the reflection that was already shared by our presenter. The Assyrian Empire is up here and is growing and growing and growing in power. Okay, so you have a little lay of the land when you hear these names of the threats, particularly to the judges and then later to Israel. That's where their locations are. All right, I'll stop that sharing and we'll get back to our work. So there's no king in Israel, and Samuel rises to power as the people were calling for a king. Why was Samuel reluctant to fulfill their wishes?
I got the impression that he was of the opinion that Israel already had a king, and the king was God.
Okay, that's it. That's the way Samuel felt. The problem was the unfaithfulness of the people to God, which means they still had no king. And so the king needs to be appointed as a human presence. I'll let that go. Why was Saul rejected by God eventually?
He was disobedient and sinned.
Disobedience and sin. Yep. He becomes extremely paranoid, as we see reflected, particularly in his treatment of David. But yeah, he's a flawed man, and his inability to help the people obey the commandments was his major flaw. David becomes the second king, brought great unity to the kingdom, located the capital in Jerusalem, was very important. How long did the nation of Israel last?
I believe she said 70 plus years.
Around 70 years. That's right, 70 years. So you think about that. Here with David, we have what is typically known as the golden age of Israel. Not only was the king effective in unifying Israel and expanding the territory, but David, as a person of faith, was extraordinary in his ability to lead the people in faith. But as we see a little bit later on, he has his issues too. What happened that brought about the demise of the kingdom after 70 years?
They worship idols.
Okay. Yeah. Who is the character at this point at about 70 years? Who's the character that is now king? Solomon. And what was his? It wasn't so much that. Well, Solomon did worship idols, but why did he come to that stage of his life where that became important to him? I mean, here's a guy who, by the way, I'll show you another share screen. Here's a guy who built the temple in Jerusalem. I mean, this is the guy who followed through on all the dreams. Here's a picture of the temple as people imagine it to have looked like.
Mhm.
Quite a significant thing, as you can see. Here would be the western wall, which is the only piece of the temple that remains. The location of the temple would have been the same. I think I showed you a picture last week of the Dome of the Rock. Well, this is the location of the Dome of the Rock as well. But later on, we'll hear descriptions of the different gates and entryways. The women were forced to stay out here. Men were allowed to go in here, but not Gentiles. And this, of course, is the Holy of Holies. So we have this as a model of what they feel through research the temple was to look like. I don't think I had another picture here. Let me just. Again, that would be essentially the Holy of Holies, and this would be only accessible to the priests. And another look at that. Okay. So, I mean, here's a guy who built the temple. Wouldn't you think that apostasy would be the last thing that would be in his head? And yet, what does he do? He is one who ends up worshiping idols, along with whom?
His wives.
His wife. 700 wives, 1,500 concubines. Man, crazy. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? And so,
No.
as he married, remember too, and this is true of during the period of the Holy Roman Empire and those years following in Europe. Why did some marriages occur?
Political alliance.
Military alliances.
Exactly, political military alliances, and the same was true with Solomon. If I marry this gal from Moab, they would be less inclined to attack me. And but the problem was, along with their this political alliance came these other gods. And of course, to keep everybody happy, Solomon had to make a lot of compromises. He's also accused of what? What else did he do besides becoming apostate?
I thought I heard her say the taxes were extremely high.
The taxes?
Yeah.
Yes, and that's to support his lifestyle that he began to develop. And there's reference made by the presenter to Deuteronomy. And I want to make sure that's where we are right now. Actually, we'll hold off on that. Down at the bottom of the page, what would Moses have said to Solomon? But his opulent lifestyle is plus his desire to build here and there. Again, when we were in the Holy Land, one of the great cities that he built was the city of Megiddo. It's in ruins now, but it's an astonishing place to go, and that was one of Solomon's responsibilities, and other places that he built. At his death, who took over? His son, and his name was Rehoboam. Rehoboam, Rehoboam. And Rehoboam was taking consultation with his wise men and other religious leaders. However, they were counseling him to cut back on taxes. But that's not what he did. In fact, he raised them, and that caused the additional burden on the people, and also set off the division into the northern and southern kingdom. It was an economic thing. It wasn't necessarily spiritual. It was a political thing. Ends up being spiritual because when they divide, they have to build a new temple. In fact, they end up building two. But this division is caused by Rehoboam, who could have gone in to follow his father Solomon and probably held the kingdom together by just being reasonable. But no, he said, we're gonna do even more. And when he taxed people, they just rebelled, and the northern kingdom split from the southern kingdom. How many tribes joined the northern kingdom?
And
Then,
And how many of the southern, of course?
yeah,
And when this time period is when the prophets arise. And to whom did the prophets speak when they got their act together?
the kings and the people.
Yeah, essentially, though, they had the ear of the king.
Right.
And the idea then, of course, was the king would then apply what the prophet said so that the people would follow, and the voice of the prophet would be heard. What was their essential message?
Failure to keep the covenant would basically lead him to disaster.
Right. And so they were all about giving a warning. Keep the covenant. Keep the covenant. And unfortunately, that's not how it went. Judah remained stable because of an unbroken line of kings. Why was Israel less stable?
most of their kings were evil. They didn't have a good line.
Okay, yeah. Could you say it any more bluntly, Sheila? Yeah, the line of kings there were highly corrupt. But let's say too, in the middle of all that, they were the ones were nearest to the threat. Nearest to the threat. If it's Assyria or Babylon, they come in from the north. And so they end up deeply corrupt, but also highly threatened by what's going on up to the north. Who conquers Israel and when?
I think it was Assyria conquered Israel, but I can't remember the date.
Okay, anybody catch that?
721 BC.
721. And when did Babylon do their number?
586.
586.
586. So we have the Assyrians attacking and conquering the northern kingdom in 721, and the Babylonians conquer the Assyrians first, but then they conquer not only the northern kingdom, but also the southern kingdom of Judah. And so by this time then, all of Israel is a vassal to the kingdom of Babylon. Now, we're going to talk about that a lot more as time passes. Historians writing from the years of the exile, which are those years after 586, had much to say about the kings, but said little to support them. How do they think of them?
Faithless.
Faithless is a good word. Corrupt might be another word. Out for themselves. And it's kind of a universal thing. Even the best of them were corrupt or had their flaws. And so she moved into then how David was flawed. What were the two things that she said about David being flawed?
Infidelity was one.
Yep, Bathsheba.
And then he arranged for Bathsheba's husband to be killed.
Yeah, that's part of the story. That's a whole highly corrupt story. And not only does he have infidelity or take another man's wife in this affair, but when the baby is announced, what does he do? Arranges, as Walt says, for Uriah to come back from the front where he's in battle so that he might go in to be with his wife. And that doesn't work because Uriah, being a military man, does not want to corrupt his strength or take away from his strength and go into his wife. So he says, I'm staying away from her. And so since that doesn't work, he's sent back to the front and is put at the front of the battle intentionally. The others withdraw and Uriah is killed. And so everything looks like it has been cared for. But do you remember who ends up being the one to call, I think I gave you this one to read, call David to account?
Nathan.
It's such a classic story, such a classic story. He comes in and says, there was a man who had a little sheep, and on and on the little story goes. And he says, what do you think should happen to this man who steals this other man's sheep? And David says, what? Do you remember? In essence, he says, he should be killed. The worst should happen to him. And then Nathan, I can just see him, Nathan going like this. Thou art the man. You are the man. And oh my, I can't even imagine how David must have felt as he was called out. There's a lot of psalms that were written as signs and signatures of David's repentance, but he does feel absolutely horrible about the whole thing. But nonetheless, his flaw is revealed. How was Solomon flawed? We already covered this to some extent.
Let's see, he murdered his potential rivals. He indulged in idolatry, a rather excessive lifestyle.
Yeah, that'll cover it. You get those three, you've aced the test. So what would Moses have to say to Solomon? This is where if you want to join me, you can get your Bibles and look at Deuteronomy chapter 17. Verses 14 through 20. And this is fascinating. And it says there, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you. Now, this is Moses prior to going into the promised land. This is their first time around. They don't go in, by the way. Giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it. And you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire a great number of horses for himself. By the way, in Megiddo, when they excavated that city, there were 100 troughs. 100 troughs. So how many horses do you think were stationed in Megiddo alone?
That's a lot.
So don't acquire great numbers of horses or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives. That's referring to the king. He must not take many wives or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. When he and his descendants will reign, then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. So yeah, what would Moses say to Solomon? Stop it. Read what's in the book of law. In other kingdoms, kings were thought to be superhuman or divine characters. What were they seen in Egypt, she said?
Regular human beings.
Not in Egypt.
I'm sorry, in Egypt they were divine.
Divine. And in Assyria and the northern
Sort of like angels, I thought, messengers of the gods.
Yeah, messengers. That's how we see angels, as messengers. Messengers or kind of intermediaries. Like there's God, and then there's me, and then there's the people. And so they're less than God, but nonetheless they seem to have the clearest channel to God. And so that's how these are seen. Very good. Good work on that. And is there anything else that you may have seen that we should maybe attend to? Any questions that you have about that? We good?
Yeah.
Then we'll move on to 10. Move on to 10. And 10 has to do mainly with the prophets as they speak to the king.
The historian of 1 Kings reviews the history of the kings of Israel and Judah and evaluates their varying degrees of success. Though the world measures success on the basis of political achievement and power, the biblical historian evaluates these kings on the basis of their faithfulness to God. But the historian emphasizes through the life of Elijah what Jin He Han describes as human survival only through the provisions of God. This, of course, is still a crucial message for God's people. Equally important is the prophetic role within society as represented in the biblical account by the figure of Elijah. Oftentimes, this prophetic voice must monitor and challenge the abuse, especially of an economic sort, that may derive from any leader's authority, even those who are called to lead God's people.
The historian of 1st and 2nd Kings tirelessly sounds the refrain of King so-and-so did evil in the sight of the Lord. No king in the north gets a passing grade, and except for a few, the kings in the south also leave behind rather disappointing legacies. The biblical tradition of the kings of Israel presents a history going from bad to worse from generation to generation. When the biblical narrative gets to the reign of Omri, worse becomes worst. A modern historian may find Omri's remarkable reign impressive. He built the new capital of the kingdom in Samaria. He established a dynasty that lasted 3 generations. Even the inscription on the Moabite stone mentions how Omri subdued Moab. And later, Assyrian kings actually referred to Israel as the land of the house of Omri. However, the historian of 1 Kings is not at all impressed with Omri's internationally renowned political achievements. The historian skims over the rule of Omri with only half a dozen verses and offers this poignant summary. Omri did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did more evil than all who were before him. According to the Bible's account, Omri contributed nothing positive to the religious life of Israel and instead encouraged Israel's idolatry. The historian of 1 and 2 Kings never measures the royal reign by how powerful the king may have been in the world, but by how faithful he was to the Lord. By that standard, there was a king even worse than Omri. That distinction is held by his son Ahab. According to the historian, Ahab, son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. Omri was the worst, and Ahab was even worse than the worst. The historian's verdict against Ahab is based on the damage he caused to the religion of Israel. Not only did Ahab continue the practices of the past kings who perverted the nation's faith, but worshiped Baal, the god of the Canaanites. Under Ahab's rule, Israel was no longer a nation that worshiped God alone. And the biblical historian is absolutely furious. Ahab did more to provoke the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than had all the kings of Israel who were before him. It is against the historical background of this lowest point in Israel's history that the prophet Elijah comes on the scene. Elijah's prophetic ministry sets out to turn the heart of the people back to the one and only true God. When the people are no longer clear whether they are to worship the Lord or Baal, and when many assume they could even worship both, Elijah proves who the one true God is by demonstrating who it is that gives the rain. The significance of Elijah's remarkable demonstration of God's power has to do with the agricultural attributes of the land of Israel. According to the book of Deuteronomy, before the children of Israel entered the land, God alerted them about the rainfall situation. For the land that you are about to enter to occupy is not like the land of Egypt, from which you have come. In Egypt, agriculture depended on the irrigation system from the Nile. But the land that you are crossing over to occupy is a land of hills and valleys, watered by rain from the sky. Literally, the text in Deuteronomy chapter 11 says that the land drinks water of the rain from heaven. Consequently, no rain, no harvest. When the people of Israel entered the land of Canaan, they encountered the Canaanites people boasting of their religious technique of assuring adequate rainfall for their field year after year. The Canaanites believed Baal, the god of storm and thunder, gave them the rain. Forgetting how God provided for them in the wilderness, Israel gradually adopted the practice of these other nations who believed that they got their water supply from Baal. Elijah set forth to prove that it was not Baal, but it was God who watered the field and provided produce. Elijah set out to make clear that to worship Baal would be betrayal. Life depended upon God alone. And so Elijah models in his own life absolute dependence on God. After he declares that there will be no rain unless God tells him to speak otherwise, Elijah is sent to Wadi Kerith, east of the Jordan, and is instructed to drink from the wadi. The wadi is an interesting phenomenon. When there is enough rain, the wadi is full of water. But after the rain stops, it will disappear. Elijah is commanded to drink from the wadi that has water only when the Lord gives rain. Elijah survives on water from the wadi and lives on food that the Lord sends to him through ravens. His very survival becomes the prophetic word. One thrives only as God provides. In the third year of the drought, God sends Elijah back to the people so that he may challenge them to choose whom they are going to serve. The timing is critical here. In the 3rd year of the drought, the people run out of even what they managed to save for the next year's planting. Another year of drought would spell a widespread famine. Now Israel is at a crossroad between choosing life and choosing death. On the eve of potential disaster, the famous contest on Mount Carmel takes place. Elijah asks the people, "How long will you go limping with 2 different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." On Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah stage an elaborate ritual for their altar. They spend many hours shouting and lacerating themselves, but to no avail. There is no sign of response from Baal. Then Elijah prays and God answers. And when the Lord accepts the sacrifice on the altar with the great consuming fire, the people cry out, "The Lord indeed is God. The Lord indeed is God." They get the point. Elijah's prophetic challenge to Ahab's idolatrous rule had political implications. Elijah's call for purity of worship put him on a collision course with the power that sponsored the Baal worship. King Ahab calls Elijah troublemaker and the king's enemy. Queen Jezebel threatens his very life. Then King Ahab's blatant disregard for the law of God reveals its violent contour in the atrocity he commits against Naboth. Ahab wants to have Naboth the vineyard for the royal vegetable garden because it is near the palace. Proximity presents an opportunity to be good neighbors, but royal greed turns it into an occasion of bloodshed. In this story, 2 types of authority clash with each other. On the one hand, the authority of God's law demands respect even from the king. And as Naboth points out, the law of God forbids that he should hand over his ancestral inheritance. On the other hand, the king claims the authority to do whatever he wants. When Naboth refused to surrender the land, Ahab takes it as a royal affront and gets depressed. Jezebel finds Ahab rather pathetic and volunteers to demonstrate to Ahab how to govern. As far as Jezebel is concerned, the king can take whatever he wants anywhere, anytime, and anyone who stands in the king's way should be eliminated like Naboth. So Naboth is put to death. All too often, that might constitute the end of the story, the end of a sad story about a person who dared to oppose the throne with integrity. But this is not just any monarchic society. In Israel, the king cannot simply set up an innocent to be murdered. So God sends Elijah to convict Ahab and Jezebel and to sentence them to death for the murder of Naboth. Once again, we see Elijah's prophetic ministry guided by a singular theme: honor God. The historian of 1 Kings would celebrate the moments when the king and the people served God with wholehearted devotion and honored God with faithfulness and justice. Unfortunately, there were not too many of those genuine moments. According to the historian of 1 Kings, the question persists: will the king and the people of God listen to the prophetic voice that demands faithfulness and justice? For God's people today, the question remains the same.
Wow.
Let's connect a couple dots. And now we're fully into the age of the prophets, as we see Elijah, then Elisha, and then the worse it gets, the more prophets begin to show up and speak. Let's see. By the world's standards, Omri is an impressive king. What are the world's standards that made him so impressive?
Power,
Power?
Something about establishing a new capital.
Yeah, he was a builder. He was a builder like Solomon was a builder and was acknowledged to be so. Omri was apparently a builder and did develop that capital.
And I think the speaker said that Omri's dynasty lasted for 3 generations. And I guess in those days, that's quite a bit of stability.
Yeah, and yeah, especially in the Northern Kingdom, as we spoke. But well, we'll get to that in a moment. Yeah, he was powerful. He built government centers, 3-generation dynasty. And how did Assyria refer to Israel during the time of Omri? Did you catch that one?
Was it land of the house of Omri?
Right. This he was given a lot of credit for the power that he had acquired, and but Omri in the scriptures receives 6 verses, and the presenter summarized those. What did those verses reflect?
I think he said Omri did what was evil in God's sight.
Mm-hmm. And what more? Because of his,
worst of all, up to that point.
yeah, of all the kings that had come before, Omri was the worst. He was absolutely the worst. And which then says to us, how were the writers of this history, how by what measures were they assessing the effectiveness of a king?
he had no positive contributions during his reign.
Yeah, especially with regard to faith. Here was a man who apparently, in the eyes of the historian, is absolutely evil, and led his people away from God rather than toward God. And so this faithlessness is what. Well, the measure is faithfulness, and Omri falls far short, and so he gets 6 verses, in spite of how the world seemed to view Omri. What did they say about Omri's son Ahab?
Oh, he was worse.
Worse yet.
Don't you love that? Omri was bad, but this Ahab, his son, was worse. So yeah, his evil was unparalleled. The nation no longer worshipped God, but how many? Essentially, there were 2. There was God and there was
Baal.
And so we have this other God appearing. Why is Baal such a powerful God in the hearts and minds of the people? What was Baal supposed to be responsible for?
Rainfall, I think.
And of course, we would know that rainfall is essential in an agricultural society. So these 2 gods are now competing. And as the presenter said, this is really the low point in the history of Israel. So along comes Elijah, and the means by which Elijah begins to work on this is to present God in competition with Baal. And through his relationship with God as a faithful prophet, he is able to help with this perception of Baal being God of rainfall and thunder and lightning, and so he proclaims what is supposed to happen now. Just to show you that Baal is not in control of this, what's going to happen?
His
Drought.
3 years drought. 3 years of drought are about to happen. And so In the third year of this drought, the people are deeply concerned. And that's when the contest is set up on the top of Mount Carmel. Again, when we were in Israel this last February, we were able to go to Mount Carmel. Now, was it the exact spot where this contest happened? Who knows? But I had never been to Mount Carmel before this past trip. My other two trips didn't take us there. But, you know, in your imagination, you begin to relive these stories. And the Carmelite sect is the ones who preserve this, that is a monastery. They are the ones who preserve this site up on top of Mount Carmel, where, of course, this contest occurred. When the prophets of Baal, and Baal had a god wife, Ashtaroth, when these prophets were dancing all about and trying to get rain to come down, they weren't successful. And what's the question essentially that Elijah asks of them? How long will you go limping with two people? Why are you a people of two opinions? And of course, the contest then is engaged. If Baal is God, then so if God is God, then so be it. And so then his demonstration. Did I have you read that story? Was that part of the assignment? Please forgive me for. Okay, so when notice how he really taunts them along the way, and then finally says, "Just pour water all over this sacrifice we're about to make. Just pour water all over it." And still, the thing is lit off by a bolt from God. And of course, then the people come to believe in God. The prophets of Baal and his consort are killed, and Jezebel says, "May the gods make me like one of them, unless by tomorrow I make you like, if I fail to make you like one of them." So she threatens Elijah. Elijah runs off to the south, ends up way down south after 40 and stays there for 40 days, and has this confrontation with God about the still small voice. And then he comes back, and we have this second confrontation having to do with Naboth's vineyard. So unpack that one. What goes on there? What does Ahab want?
The vineyard, because it's close by.
Yeah, it's close by. And what is he? What's the position that he takes?
I think he offers him either the market value of the vineyard in gold or silver or something like that, or he'll get him another vineyard somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. And okay, and then the essence of it is that's unacceptable, because it's a generational thing, it's a family thing, and so he goes back to the palace. And who does he chat with?
His wife.
Jezebel.
Talks with Jezebel. And Jezebel really is the mover here. Jezebel, I see Ahab as kind of a Casper Milquetoast sort of a character. And Jezebel is really the mover and shaker of this whole operation. And she kind of mocks him, saying, what kind of a king are you? Let me show how to handle this. And of course, what's next?
She has, whatever the gentleman's name was.
Naboth. Yep. Naboth is killed. The vineyard is taken. And into that situation, Elijah returns. Okay. And again, it's a classic, I wouldn't say this is a confrontation, but a classic conversation where Ahab sees Elijah coming. When they come face to face, Ahab says, "You have found me, O my enemy." And Elijah says, "I have found you." And in that confrontation, of course, Ahab and Jezebel are violently killed, and the means of the kingdom are restored, so to speak. But the next king doesn't do very well either. But this is the work of the prophet as it begins to unfold. What is the bottom line of the judgment upon the kings of Israel and Judah as they experience the dividing? What's kind of the bottom line here?
Exile.
What's that again?
The exile.
The exile. Yeah, well, that's the bottom line of accountability. Remember the infant stage where we don't like the accountability or we can't see the consequences? The prophets are banging out consequences, but they aren't seeing it. And so the corruption continues until such time as the exile occurs. Exactly. I guess we could say kind of a bottom line is you either practice faithfulness or here are the consequences. You either do justice or here are the consequences. And the kings, as most of the kings, as they unfold the career of the kings, they don't do very well. For whatever reasons, the kingdom just doesn't work out. And then, as Sheila shared, the exile is the final blow. Okay. Now, the next thing I want to do is very briefly talk about the prophets. And I want to do a share screen on this because I have some material up on that. And I want to begin with a sense of definition. And there I've revealed the answer. I wanted you to think about it a minute, but went down too low. So what is a prophet? A prophet is one who speaks divine revelation before others. Prophets have been thought of as God's mouthpiece or God's bullhorn. As they speak for God and tell the people of the movement that they would expect as they conduct their office. The office of a prophet is to speak for God. Samuel is the bridge to the from the time of the judges. He is the last judge. Okay, he is the last judge. He's the bridge because he leaves the work of the judge behind to become the first prophet. So there's a dual office that Samuel holds that introduces us to the office of the prophet. And obviously this appears at a very consequential time of history as they move from the period of the judges into the period where the king becomes the unifying factor. Prophets have charisma. They are gifted with qualities that attract attention, that attract people. Samuel had a group of disciples that traveled with him. If you read the whole saga of Samuel in 1st and 2nd Samuel, you will see that the saga includes, I guess you would call them disciples or I'm reluctant to use the word school, but on the other hand, that's kind of what happens as these disciples travel with him, just as that did with Jesus. All prophets seem to have the ear of the king. When the prophet speaks, the king is the one who is supposed to be listening. They have the creative faculty of utterance. usually in a highly personal style. And when they speak, again, people listen. You have people in your lives that, even if you disagree with them, when they talk, you listen. Do you have people like that that are out there or have influenced you over the course of time? Just people that you have a kindred spirit with, or they're out there, and usually the prophet is one of those, where like Ahab and Elijah, you have found me, O my enemy. They didn't agree with one another at all, but when Elijah talks, Ahab and Jezebel, whether she admits it or not, would listen. And of course, they were profound religious thinkers. So prophets then become active from the time of Samuel, who was the first prophet, all the way into the exile and after the exile, because the prophet, as you'll read a bit next week, the prophet is the one who then delivers a voice of hope that the exile isn't going to last forever. You maintain faithfulness, and the remnant then is allowed to return to the land that was promised. After the exile, the prophetic office kind of disappeared. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to, in that day there was no prophet in Israel, and they disappear. Their office disappears, and that's largely caused, as I've written here, because of the weakened state of Israel and their political impotence. I mean, nobody cared about Israel. And now we're going to begin to see the beginning of the Roman Empire. Nobody cared about Israel. The Romans didn't really think of Israel as being a threat of any kind. And so why would the prophet be concerned about speaking? Why would God raise up a prophet with such an unimportant region? So what is the, I've given you a definition of what a prophet is: one who speaks divine revelation before others, God's mouthpiece, God's bullhorn. The others particularly have to do with the king. But when we think of the word prophet, and maybe we've talked about this before, I've talked about it so many times, so many places. When we think of the word prophet, we usually automatically project a definition on it. What is it that the prophet does besides speak divine revelation? If I am prophetic, what do you think I'm doing?
Predicting the future.
Looking into the future. Okay.
Warning.
Yes, and that has to be said very carefully, because I'm going to be prophetic for you right now, and I'm going to be prophetic in the modern day, and I'm going to say, look, the average child in the United States of America spends 6 hours a day in front of the television. Now, that is the reality. Now, the prophet part of it is going to say, if you continue to allow your children to spend 6 hours a day in front of the television, their heads are going to turn to mush. Okay, so you get a sense for how the prophet's work goes. It recognizes that something is wrong, that we came from something that was right, something is wrong, and now we are moving toward something that needs corrected. The prophet's work is not to tell the future, although they did. The prophet's work is always to issue the warning and call for correction. If there's a phrase I want you to remember about what the prophets were up to, and this is universally true, is call for correction. Call for correction. That's what they did from the moment Samuel took the office until we get into the later prophets, including Daniel, which is the last book of the Bible, of the Old Testament, that was written. The diagram for this is, again, I'll apologize here. I'm going to stop my share. Diagram for this is something like this. and I guess I'll apologize, but not very much. Here is the world as God intends. You know, we go back again. Along the way, I'm trying to connect all the dots from Genesis all the way through. We go back to Genesis, and what does God intend? Harmony. You know, this is a state of harmony. However, we get this movement into chaos. Again, we can think of it as sitting down at the piano, and Laura's going to play us a C chord, and it sounds very nice. Okay, C, E, G, C, and it's going to sound nice. But then she's going to slam her hand down like my grandson does on our piano. Slam his hand down on it, and you're going to hear dissonance and not harmony. The prophet is the one who knows God's intention, knows what Israel should be like with justice and righteousness and following God, but sees all this noise, this chaos going on, so that he in looking at all that distortion, he calls them back into harmony, back to recover God's intention. But I wanted you to see again, to unify our journey through all of Scripture. Notice what it looks like: harmony, disharmony, the call to harmony. If they don't follow the call to harmony, what happens? The wheels going around? Correction. The prophet would much rather see them correct themselves rather than have to go through all of this pain. But human beings being what they are, guess what? The correction has to be applied. Bad things happen. The prophet is able to predict this based on what is going on now. I tell you, if you keep acting like this, if you keep your children in front of the television for 6 hours a day, this is what's going to happen. If you keep behaving like this, O nation of Israel, this is what's going to happen. And so God uses corrective means by which to correct this mess. And the means that appear on the horizon are Assyria and Babylon. So that is the means by which God applies the corrective in terms of the nations that are around. Harmony, disharmony, distortion, chaos. And the call is by the prophet is, let's get back to harmony. Let's get back to harmony. Okay. So that's where I wanted to go this evening as we talk about this. I mean, this is probably between the judges and the kings. I mean, we know the stories of David. Many people know the story of Solomon. We know the story of Elijah and Ahab and Jezebel. I mean, these stories, if you've been around Sunday school and you paid attention in worship, those stories get preached about. But then you come to these other kings like Omri, who gets 6 verses. This is a period of time that people don't spend a lot of time on. And so the judges and the kings we're sprinting right past them now. And we're going to move into the end days as we look next time, the end days of the kingdom, as now they are forced to go into exile. And this is a very important period of time that we have just sprinted through. And so I want to honor you by saying, are there questions that you developed along the way that maybe we can talk through or chat about before we close out for the evening? Anything that, as you read, that maybe was that emerged as an issue?
Not that I'm quite ready to articulate, but as we do this, I think we're probably all asking ourselves the same question: how does this relate to what we're going through today? I think I could take a stab at it, but I don't think I'm quite ready for
Yeah.
prime time.
Well, isn't that the issue of faith at any time? You know, how do we live our faith out in our contemporary world? Is clearly the issue that's in front of each one of us in our faith journey. We've got to have integrity about that. But as we, you know, again, I don't know how specific you want to get on this, because you know, you can watch the news from whatever angle you like to watch the news from and get highly irritated about what you see. But didn't we state a truth last time when we did that? And I don't have that thing here. When we did the wheel, didn't we state a truth? That wheel ran through the history of Israel, but it's still running, and it still bears truth to us. It still says here are the points at which our corrections need to be made, and doggone it, we don't get it. And so God visits us with a correction. You know, I don't know if that starts to get at it, Walt, but you know, you're very astute in just asking the question. All I can say to you is keep your eyes open all the time, because it's happening all the time. I'm thinking of international now. When there were over in Northern Africa, and just these days there have been some monstrous misdeeds done, and I haven't seen. I mean, we've tried to diplomatically do some changes there, but I haven't seen anybody go in there and be a Babylon to all the junk that goes on in you know, kidnapping 400 girls from their school, eradicating whole villages of Christians. What, you know, when will God visit the correction on that, and what will it look like? I mean, we can play with that all we want, but it's you know, how is God judging the United States of America as we have lived through a pandemic? What is going on there? And only those who are listening for the lessons God is trying to teach and watching for the lessons and have a heart open to those lessons, I think, are the ones who sense the correction and hopefully are trying to make it. You know, the racial issues. Why did it take the death of George Floyd to raise up an issue that we should be dealing with? That it's no wonder people are angry. So you know, I don't have a. There are prophetic voices out there that, and frankly, our voice should be prophetic from time to time, as we seek to do good, and act godly in our world. I don't maintain that to be any kind of final word. It's an unfolding thing, and the wheel of history keeps rolling. It's not a done deal. When I'm gone from this life, the wheel's gonna keep rolling.
Keep going.
What do we see? What do we hear? How do we act in the face of that is our issue. It's a fun question. It's a very fun question and disturbing at the same time. Well, thank you all. I'm glad we had this time to share, and you know, I became acutely aware that we didn't open with prayer, but we're sure going to end with prayer. Let us pray. Living and eternal God, we thank you for being part of our conversation. We thank you for the lessons that Scripture continues to teach us if we have open hearts and open minds. We thank you that you trouble the water within us to ask questions like, how does this matter to us in our day? What are you saying to us where we live and how we work that perhaps suggests a prophetic word that needs to be spoken here and there along the way? What's next for us as we try to understand what is next for Israel? We look forward to the ways you touch our lives, and we ask that you would continue to do that, and that you would inspire us to do what John Wesley was very clear to say, to do no harm, to do all the good that we can, and to stay in love with you with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Perhaps that is our first task as we share together on a continuing basis in our studies. Thank you. Amen. Okay, I sent out next numbers 11 and 12, and I sent some reading assignments out. I hope all of you got that. And if you know of others who you think should join us, go ahead and encourage them, and we can catch up every now and then. Okay.
How many more weeks are there?
Oh, I don't know. There's 32 lessons, so I'm doubling them up. So you can do there are a couple lessons coming up that I may stop at a portion of the Old Testament, although I'm reluctant to do that because we know the New Testament better than we know the Old Testament. So I don't know. But I'm the teacher, so I guess I have the right to determine what's next, huh?
I wasn't asking for myself, by the way, Roger. I was just thinking about asking, a couple other people to see if they'd be interested in joining. And, you need to be able to tell them that it isn't too late,
Yeah, I never think it's too late. And one of the things I can always do is remember we're after themes. I can always go back and catch the harmony, disharmony, 4 things that are wrong. I mean, that's Genesis, and it's captured throughout all of what we've studied so far, right? I mean, you see it again and again. So I can catch people up pretty quickly to be where we are. However, another good place to start up would, and again, I'm trying to decide whether or not to do a couple of these chapters in the Old Testament, because some of them are not quite as interesting as the others. And so when you get,
I saw you there, Sheila.
Yeah, do I have a rebellion on my hands? When you get to the end of the Old Testament, there's you've heard the issues. They're the same. Now, I do think there's value in talking about Job. I think that's such an unusual book. And so I have some decisions to make, but maybe what I'll do is make sure I tell you, okay, we're going to move into the New Testament, and that would be an excellent time to get connected. So, okay.
Okay.
All right.
Love you guys. Be good.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Night.